From ancient Egypt to the Roaring Twenties, humans found increasingly bizarre ways to say "I do." We've gone from sacrificing pigs to hunting for silver animals in cake. Spoiler alert, it doesn't get better, folks. Join us on a hilarious journey through matrimonial madness that'll make you grateful for your simple "speak now or forever hold your peace" ceremony. Trust us, by the end, you'll be saying "I don't" to these crazy customs. Ancient Egypt, the pharaoh's daughter's milk bath. Let's dive into the wacky world of ancient Egyptian bridal beauty routines. Back in 3000 BCE, if you were a pharaoh's daughter getting hitched, you didn't just splash around in the Nile and call it a day. Nope. You took a nice long soak in donkey milk. Yep, donkey milk. These royal brides thought it'd make them look fabulous and maybe boost their baby-making mojo. Talk about a unique pre-wedding ritual. Now let's crunch some numbers. An average bathtub holds about 80 gallons. To fill that sucker with donkey milk, you'd need to milk about 70 donkeys. That's a whole lot of udder pulling, folks. Cleopatra, Egypt's last active pharaoh from 5130 BCE, was all about this trend. While she probably didn't keep 700 donkeys just for bathing, as some wild stories claim, she was definitely into her milk baths. Here's a fun fact. Fresh donkey milk doesn't actually stink. It's got a mild sweet scent, kind of like human breast milk. So these royal brides weren't walking down the aisle smelling like a barn. They were probably smelling pretty darn good. But donkey milk wasn't just for brides. Both guys and gals of the upper crust used various milk baths for their skin. Cow and goat milk got in on the action too, but donkey milk was the creme de la creme. During the Old Kingdom period, 2686 to 2181 BCE, milk was so fancy that people sometimes offered it to pharaohs as a gift. The pyramid texts, some super old religious writings from around 2400 to 2300 BCE, even mention milk as something that could purify you. Milk baths weren't the only weird beauty treatment in ancient Egypt. They also slapped crocodile poop on their faces as masks and used lead-based eye makeup. These folks took their beauty routines seriously. But here's the kicker. Donkey milk actually contains lactic acid, which can exfoliate and moisturize skin. So maybe these ancient Egyptians were onto something. Next time you use a fancy moisturizer with lactic acid, remember, you're using a beauty secret that's older than the pyramids. Ancient Rome, the pig sacrifice. All right, buckle up for some Roman wedding fun. In 500 BCE, if you wanted to get hitched in style, you had to get your hands dirty. And by dirty, I mean bloody. The happy couple would kick off their big day by slaughtering a pig. Nothing says "I do" like a dead swine, right? This wasn't just any bacon run. It was a full-on religious ceremony called Porca Prasidinea. The pig was offered to Ceres, goddess of agriculture. Apparently, Ceres was really into pork. Maybe she was the original BBQ enthusiast. Now here's where it gets interesting. The bride and groom had to perform the sacrifice themselves. Imagine trying to keep your toga clean while wrestling a 200-pound porker. Talk about pre-wedding jitters. Emperor Augustus, ruling from 27 BCE to 14 CE, was a big fan of this tradition. He even made it law that no marriage was valid without animal sacrifice. Way to put the ow in vow, Augustus. But what if you were a vegetarian bride in ancient Rome? Tough luck. There's a record from 215 BCE of a bride named Claudia Quinta who tried to substitute the pig with a large turnip. She was accused of impiety and almost executed. Talk about wedding day drama. The pig's intestines were then examined by a haruspex, a religious official, to predict the future of the marriage. If the guts looked good, party on. If not, well, hope you kept the receipt for those wedding gifts. This tradition lasted until Christianity took over in the 4th century CE. The new Roman motto became, "No more bacon before basic vows." Sparta, the bride in drag. Around 700 BCE, Spartan brides didn't walk down the aisle in flowing white gowns. Nope, they shaved their heads and threw on some men's clothes. Talk about a plot twist for the groom. Here's how it went down. The bride would be whisked away by a female relative, usually an aunt who wasn't getting any action herself. This aunt would give the bride a makeover that'd make RuPaul cringe. Off went the hair, on went the man's cloak and sandals, then they'd leave the bride alone in a dark room. Talk about a unique wedding night. Pitch darkness and gender-bending attire included. Meanwhile, the groom was out doing what Spartan men did best, drinking with his buddies. When he finally stumbled to the bridal chamber, he'd find his new husband waiting for him. Surprise! The idea was to ease the transition from single to married life. Because apparently Spartan men were so used to being around other men that seeing a woman in women's clothing would have been too much of a shock. Makes you wonder about those long military campaigns, doesn't it? This tradition lasted for centuries. Even King Agesilaus II, who ruled from 400 360 BCE, had to go through this. Imagine being the most powerful man in Sparta and still having to play Find the Bride on your wedding night. The bride didn't get to grow her hair out after the wedding either. Spartan women kept their hair short, making them look like the manliest of Greeks, according to the historian Plutarch. Spartan women, so tough they were often mistaken for teenage boys. That's girl power, ancient style. Now, if you think your wedding traditions are weird, just remember, at least you're not playing an ancient Greek version of Guess Who on your wedding night, unless you're into that sort of thing. Viking Age, the month-long mead marathon. Welcome to Viking wedding traditions, where till death do us part might happen sooner than you think, thanks to alcohol poisoning. In 800 CE, Viking newlyweds didn't just toast with champagne and call it a night. Nope. They embarked on a month-long mead bender. That's right, 30 days of non-stop boozing. They called it the honeymoon, which literally meant honey month, because mead is made from fermented honey. The bride's family had to supply enough mead for the couple to drink every day for a month. We're talking about 15 gallons of the stuff. Hope they had a good meadery on speed dial. This wasn't just for fun, although, let's be real, Vikings loved a good party. It was believed that drinking mead for a month would increase fertility. The tradition was so important that if the bride's family couldn't afford enough mead, the marriage could be annulled. Talk about liquid assets. King Harald Fairhair, who ruled Norway from 872 to 930 CE, reportedly drank so much during his honeymoon that he conquered most of Norway in a mead-fueled rampage. Guess some people are angry drunks even in the 9th century. But here's the kicker. Viking weddings gave birth to the profession of professional wedding guest. These were people who could hold their liquor and keep the party going for a full month. Imagine putting that on your resume. There's a story of one such guest, Orm Storolfsson, who drank so much at a wedding in 1000 CE that he picked up a 433-pound log and took 3 steps. He then promptly dropped dead. Talk about going out with a bang. Medieval Europe, the bride's shoe auction. Let's kick it old school, medieval style. In 1200 CE, European weddings weren't complete without a good old-fashioned shoe auction. Yep, you heard that right. Footwear was the hot commodity at these shindigs. Here's how it went down. During the reception, the bride's shoe would be stolen. Then, guests would bid on it like it was the last loaf of bread during a plague. The winner got to present the shoe to the bride, and supposedly, a boatload of good luck. King Philip II of France, ruling from 1180 to 1223, once bid 10,000 francs for a bride's shoe. That's about $200,000 in today's money. Talk about putting your foot in your mouth, Phil. But here's where it gets wild. In 1242, at a noble wedding in Burgundy, a left-footed bride caused absolute chaos. Guests fought over her lucky left shoe, believing it to be twice as fortunate. The brawl got so bad that 3 duels were fought the next day, over a shoe. Medieval folks, am I right? The tradition wasn't all fun and games, though. Some crafty brides in the 14th century started wearing ridiculously expensive shoes to jack up the bids. One bride in 1387 wore shoes adorned with 36 pearls and 240 garnets. Subtle. This shoe shenanigan led to the creation of the wedding planner profession. Someone had to keep track of the shoe and make sure it didn't actually get stolen. Imagine that job interview. So, what are your qualifications? Well, I'm really good at watching shoes. The tradition finally died out in the 16th century, when some genius invented wedding rings. Apparently, people preferred exchanging small metal circles to bidding on smelly footwear. Renaissance Italy, the salt and bread ritual. Alright, let's spice things up with some Renaissance Italian wedding traditions. And by spice, I mean salt. Lots of salt. In 1500 CE Italy, couples didn't just exchange rings, they got all symbolic with salt and bread. The groom would give the bride salt, and she'd give him bread. Then they'd eat it. Romantic, right? The salt represented life's difficulties because, salt in a wound, while bread stood for prosperity. So basically, they were saying, here's to a life of pain and carbs. Sounds about right. This tradition was so important that Venice, the salt capital of Europe, made it illegal for couples to marry without exchanging salt. In 1516, Doge Leonardo Loredan decreed that saltless marriages were null and void. Talk about being worth your salt. But here's where it gets crazy. In 1573, a massive storm wrecked Venice's salt production. Suddenly, salt was more valuable than gold. Couples were using tiny grains for their weddings. Some clever folks started using pretzel bits instead. Thus, the great pretzel wedding era of Venice began. The Catholic Church wasn't too happy about this carb substitution. Pope Gregory XIII called it a mockery of sacred tradition. But he also had a calendar named after him, so maybe he was just salty about everything. This salt shortage led to a boom in the salt smuggling business. One famous smuggler, Marco the Salt King Polo, no relation to the explorer, made a fortune sneaking salt into Venice for weddings. He was caught in 1579 and forced to eat an entire loaf of bread without water. The tradition finally fizzled out in the 17th century when people realized exchanging food at weddings was kind of weird. Plus, everyone was sick of pretzels. Tudor England, the bride pie surprise. All right, let's slice into some Tudor wedding weirdness. In 1550s England, they took "you are what you eat" way too seriously. Enter the bride pie. No, not a pie made of brides. It was a savory meat pie with a glass ring hidden inside. Guests would dig in, hoping to find the ring and win some good luck. A wedding ring on your cake? More like a choking hazard with a side of "till death do us part." King Henry VIII, between beheading wives, was a big fan of this tradition. At his wedding to Anne Boleyn in 1533, he ordered a bride pie so massive it took 6 men to carry. Guess he wanted to make sure there was enough pie to go around, unlike wives. But here's where it gets juicy. In 1587, in the town of Norwich, the best pie maker, a woman named Agnes Bowker, eloped the night before a big wedding. Panic ensued. The wedding party had to make do with a hastily assembled pie filled with old boots and chicken feathers. Guests were pulling leather and feathers out of their teeth for days. This fiasco led to the creation of the backup baker profession. Weddings would hire 2 pie makers, just in case one ran off. Talk about planning ahead. The tradition got so competitive that in 1602, a man named Thomas Nash wrote a pamphlet called The Anatomy of Absurdity, criticizing people who'd swallow a gudgeon to catch a ring. A gudgeon is a small fish. Imagine fishing for jewelry in your dinner. Yum. The bride pie tradition finally crumbled in the 18th century when people realized putting non-edible objects in food was, well, stupid. Colonial America, the prank-filled chivalry. Welcome to the chivalry, a charming tradition where newlyweds were terrorized by their entire town, because nothing says "congrats on your marriage" like a good old-fashioned harassment campaign. Here's how it went down. On the wedding night, the whole community would gather outside the couple's house. They'd bang pots and pans, shoot guns in the air, and generally make a racket that'd wake the dead. Then they'd burst in and drag the couple out of bed for some fun. George Washington, in his pre-presidential days, wrote about a chivalry he witnessed in 1748. He said it was a most barbaric custom, but still participated. Way to take the high road, George. The pranks could get pretty wild. In 1704, in Salem, Massachusetts, yeah, that's Salem, a couple was forced to ride backwards on a donkey through town. The donkey was drunk. How do you get a donkey drunk, you ask? Colonial ingenuity, my friends. But here's where it gets crazy. In 1792, in a small town in Virginia, an overzealous community accidentally chivalried the wrong house. They ended up renovating the local minister's home, thinking it was the newlyweds. They painted the walls, rearranged furniture, even planted a garden. The minister woke up to a brand new house and a lot of confused pranksters. This mix-up led to the creation of the wedding night guard job. Couples would hire someone to stand outside their house and direct the mob to the right place. Imagine that on a resume. Professional chaos coordinator. The chivalry tradition finally died out in the late 19th century when people realized that maybe, just maybe, newlyweds wanted some privacy. Shocking, I know. Victorian era, the bride's cake pull. In 1850s England, they decided cake wasn't exciting enough, so they turned it into a game of pull the ribbon, seal your fate. Here's the deal. The wedding cake had ribbons baked into it, each attached to a charm. Bridesmaids would yank these ribbons out, and whatever charm they got supposedly predicted their future. Supporting the happy couple by waging war over frosting designs? Ah, the joys of modern matrimony. Queen Victoria, not content with just ruling an empire, kicked this trend into high gear at her daughter's wedding in 1858. The cake had 150 charms. Talk about overcompensating, Vicky. But here's where it gets wild. In 1872, at a high society wedding in London, one charm was accidentally swapped with a cursed Egyptian amulet. The bridesmaid who pulled it, Lady Ernestine Wyndham, supposedly turned into a cat for a week. Okay, she probably just got food poisoning, but the cursed charm story spread like wildfire. This led to the birth of the charm authenticator profession. Wealthy families would hire experts to verify their cake charms weren't cursed. Imagine that job interview. So, what are your qualifications? Well, I'm really good at not turning into animals. The tradition got so intense that by 1890, there was a black market for guaranteed lucky charms. One con artist, Timothy Lucky O'Malley, made a fortune selling authentic charms that were actually just bits of old kettles. The cake pull craze finally fizzled out in the early 1900s when people realized that maybe, just maybe, their futures weren't determined by cake decorations. Shocking, I know. But before it died out, the tradition spawned some truly bizarre superstitions. In 1897, a group of bridesmaids in Manchester formed a secret society called the Order of the Silver Thimble, after all pulling thimble charms at a wedding. They believed they were destined to start a sewing revolution. Spoiler alert, they didn't. The last recorded cake pull was in 1912 at a wedding in Cardiff. The bride, fed up with the whole thing, replaced all the charms with pieces of coal. Her message was clear: the future is what you make it, not what you pull out of a cake. Early 20th century, the groom's cake animal hunt. In 1920s America, it wasn't enough for the groom to just eat his cake. No, he had to hunt for a tiny silver animal hidden inside it. Searching for tiny farm animals in your sweets? That's one way to prove you're ready for wedded bliss. The tradition started in New Orleans. The animal you found supposedly predicted your future. A pig meant prosperity, a rabbit meant lots of kids, and a chicken. Well, let's just say it wasn't a good sign for the wedding night. President Warren G. Harding, at his inauguration in 1921, had a groom's cake with a silver elephant inside. Subtle political statement there, Warren. He choked on the elephant and had to be saved by the First Lady. But here's where it gets nuts. In 1923, the Great Silver Shortage hit. Suddenly, those little silver animals were worth more than the cake itself. People were attending weddings just to score some silver. This led to the rise of the cake guard profession. Couples would hire tough guys to stand around the cake and make sure no one stole the silver animal before the groom found it. Imagine that job: professional dessert bouncer. The shortage got so bad that people started using chocolate animals instead. In 1925, a chocolatier in Chicago, Tony Sweet Tooth Genovese, made a fortune selling chocolate animals to desperate couples. He later admitted they were just melted down Easter bunnies. The horror. The tradition finally died out in the 1930s during the Great Depression. Turns out, when you're standing in a breadline, digging through cake for toys loses its appeal. Who would have thought? But not before it spawned some truly wild situations. In 1927, a groom in Boston found a silver skunk in his cake. The smell? Real. The divorce? Immediate. Guess you could say that marriage stunk from the start. And let's not forget the Great Cake Caper of 1928. A gang of silver-hungry thieves hit 6 weddings in one night, making off with a menagerie of tiny metal critters. The headline: mascot rustlers strike again. Cops never caught them, probably too busy laughing. By 1929, some genius invented the cake X-ray to find the animal before cutting. Glowing cake, anyone? This radioactive dessert trend got shut down quicker than you can say nuclear nuptials. Roaring 20s, the rise of wedding registries. Hold on to your cloche hats, folks. We're diving into the world of 1920s wedding gifts, where "it's the thought that counts" got replaced by "it's the electric toaster that counts." In 1925, Marshall Field's department store in Chicago revolutionized the wedding game by introducing the first bridal registry. Suddenly, couples could tell their guests exactly what they wanted. No more guessing, no more duplicate gifts, and definitely no more hand-knitted doilies from Aunt Gertrude. Concept spread faster than bathtub gin at a speakeasy. By 1930, most major department stores had jumped on the registry bandwagon. It was like Amazon's wish list, but with more Art Deco and less next-day delivery. Now you might think this was all about practicality, but oh no, this was the roaring 20s. Everything had to be bigger, better, and blingier. Couples weren't just registering for pots and pans, they were going all out. Take the infamous case of Gloria Swanson, silent film star extraordinaire. For her 1925 wedding to the Marquis de la Falaise, fancy, she registered for a gold-plated bathtub. But here's where it gets wild. In 1927, a couple in New York, the Astors, registered for a live alligator. Apparently, they thought it would make a great guard dog. The store actually found one. The marriage lasted 6 months. The alligator? It lived in Central Park for 20 years. This led to the rise of the registry consultant profession. Stores hired experts to help couples choose appropriate gifts. Imagine that job. No, Mrs. Johnson, I don't think a personal Zeppelin is a practical wedding gift. The most outrageous registry, that honor goes to film director Erich von Stroheim. For his 1926 wedding, he registered for a full-size replica of the Eiffel Tower. When the store couldn't deliver, he settled for a 6-foot model. It later fell on him during an earthquake. But it wasn't all glitz and glamour. The registry trend sparked a heated debate about the commercialization of love. In 1928, etiquette expert Emily Post wrote, "A wedding should not be confused with a shopping expedition." Clearly, she never tried to furnish a home with nothing but doilies and good wishes. The Great Depression put a damper on extravagant registries, but the concept survived. By the 1950s, registries were standard practice. Today, you can register for anything from honeymoon funds to charitable donations.